1943, Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto led 120 screaming Japanese soldiers in a banzai charge against American lines, fixing bayonets, raising swords, believing their spirit would overcome enemy guns, only to watch his entire company evaporate in 4 minutes as perfectly coordinated American artillery turned the battlefield into a mathematical killing zone. The Americans never even saw them up close. They just calmly radioed grid coordinates while 18 artillery battalions fired in perfect synchronization, their shells arriving at the exact same second from different positions miles apart. But how did the U.S. military transform artillery from individual guns firing blindly into a precise, coordinated system so devastatingly effective that Japanese courage became completely irrelevant? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1943, the Pacific Ocean stretched like an endless blue carpet dotted with tiny islands that had become the bloodiest battlegrounds on Earth. Japan had swept across Asia like a typhoon, conquering territories from the frozen edges of China to the tropical beaches of the Philippines. The rising sun flag flew over millions of square miles, and in Tokyo, military leaders believed their empire would last 1,000 years. Every Japanese citizen learned from childhood that their emperor was divine, a living god whose word was absolute law. To die for him was the greatest honor a person could achieve. To surrender was a shame so deep it would stain a family's name forever. The Japanese military built its entire philosophy on an ancient warrior code called Bushido, the way of the samurai. This code taught that spirit and determination mattered more than weapons or numbers. A soldier with a pure heart and unwavering courage could defeat any enemy, no matter how strong. Japanese officers told their men that Americans were soft and weak, spoiled by easy lives and material comforts. They said American soldiers would break and run when faced with true warriors willing to die. This belief ran so deep that it shaped every battle plan, every training exercise, every speech given to troops before combat. In military academies across Japan, young officers studied the victories of their grandfathers, samurai who had fought with swords and spears. They learned that the human spirit, what they called Yamatoda Damashi, was Japan's secret weapon. Factories might produce guns and ships, but factories could not produce the iron will to charge into enemy fire without hesitation. This was Japan's advantage, they were told. This would win the war. The tactics reflected this thinking. Japanese commanders planned human wave attacks called banzai charges, where hundreds or thousands of soldiers would fix bayonets and rush enemy positions in overwhelming numbers. The goal was not just to break through defenses, but to break the enemy's mind, to inspire such terror that Americans would flee rather than face warriors who embraced death. These charges had worked in China. They had worked in Malaya. Japanese soldiers had seen British and Dutch troops abandon their positions when faced with screaming men charging with swords held high. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto embodied everything the Japanese military valued. At 24 years old, he came from a samurai family in Hiroshima, a lineage stretching back 300 years. His grandfather had fought in the wars that modernized Japan, and the old man's sword hung in a place of honor in the family home. Takeshi had been educated at prestigious schools where teachers emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice above all else. He wrote poetry in his spare time, delicate verses about cherry blossoms falling like the lives of brave soldiers, beautiful and brief. Takeshi had proven himself in combat. He had led night raids through the jungles of Malaya, moving silently through darkness to strike British camps. He had fought in the Philippines, where his company captured an American supply depot after the defenders retreated. Every victory reinforced what he had been taught. American soldiers could not match Japanese determination. They relied too much on equipment and supplies. When things got difficult, they gave up. Now Takeshi commanded 120 men, a reinforced infantry company stationed on a small island in the Pacific. The island had a name that meant nothing to most people before the war, but now American and Japanese forces were fighting over it with desperate fury. Whoever controlled these tiny dots of land controlled the ocean around them, and whoever controlled the ocean could win the war. The island had coconut palms, white sand beaches, and coral reefs. It also had artillery, machine guns, and thousands of men digging into the earth, preparing to kill each other. Takeshi's men trusted him completely. He shared their hardships, eating the same meager rations of rice and dried fish. He led from the front in every fight. He knew their families' names and wrote letters to parents when soldiers died. His company had lost 30 men in the past 2 months, but morale remained high. They believed in their mission. They believed in their emperor. They believed in Lieutenant Yamamoto. The conditions on the island were harsh. Food arrived irregularly because American submarines hunted Japanese supply ships. Artillery shells were rationed carefully because factories back home could not produce enough. Medical supplies ran low. Men with infected wounds had to make do with boiled bandages used over and over. But Japanese soldiers were trained to endure hardship. Suffering built character. Comfort made men weak. Takeshi noticed that American positions seemed different from what he had faced before. The Americans had landed on the other side of the island 2 weeks ago, and instead of building deep, complex fortifications, they dug relatively shallow trenches. Their positions looked almost careless, as if they were not taking the Japanese threat seriously. Intelligence reports mentioned that Americans had developed new coordination methods, but details were vague. Some veterans who had survived earlier battles whispered about impossible firepower, about artillery fire so heavy the ground itself seemed to explode. But officers dismissed these reports as exaggerations or cowardice. One evening, Takeshi stood with his fellow officers looking at maps by candlelight. They were planning a major assault. High Command had ordered a coordinated attack along a 3-kilometer front. Over 2,000 Japanese soldiers would strike simultaneously at dawn, overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers and fighting spirit. The plan was simple: fix bayonets, charge across open ground, break through the first line of defense, and push the Americans back to the beach. Then Japanese artillery would shell the beach while the Americans evacuated, if they could. The other officers were confident. Captain Sato, who commanded the company next to Takeshi's, pointed at the map with enthusiasm. The Americans had only been on the island for 2 weeks, he argued. They had not had time to prepare properly. Their positions are thin and weak. One strong push would break them. But something bothered Takeshi, though he could not name it exactly. He had walked forward to observe American lines. The positions were quiet, strangely quiet. American soldiers moved around casually, not showing the nervous energy of men expecting an attack. Supply trucks came and went. He saw no panic, no frantic digging, no signs of fear. It was as if the Americans were waiting for something, almost inviting the Japanese to attack. That night, Takeshi walked among his men as they prepared. They cleaned their rifles, sharpened their bayonets, and wrote final letters home. Some men tied white headbands around their foreheads with the rising sun symbol painted in red. These hachimaki headbands marked them as warriors ready to die. The men sang songs quietly, old ballads about ancient battles. They passed around a bottle of sake, taking small ceremonial sips. Each man knew he might die when the sun came up, and each man accepted this possibility with calm dignity. Takeshi checked his grandfather's sword one last time, sliding it from its wooden sheath. The blade gleamed even in the dim light. It had been forged in 1850 by a master swordsmith, folded steel created through hundreds of hours of work. The weapon was a link to his ancestors, to the samurai tradition that defined his family. Carrying it into battle was an honor and a responsibility. The men synchronized their watches. 4:30 in the morning. In 1 hour, they would begin moving forward through the darkness. At 5:30, exactly at dawn, the attack would begin. Takeshi told his men they were ready. He told them their ancestors watched them. He told them the Emperor was counting on their courage. He told them that Americans could not stand against warriors with pure hearts. But as he spoke these words, something nagged at the back of his mind. The American positions had seemed too quiet, too calm, almost too easy to approach. The shallow trenches did not make sense for an army trying to defend. And there had been that strange silence, broken only by the distant sound of American voices on radios, speaking calmly in their foreign language, as if they were discussing something routine and unremarkable. Takeshi pushed these thoughts away. Doubt was the enemy of action. His duty was clear. His men needed confidence, not questions. Tomorrow, they would charge across that open ground, and their courage would prove stronger than American weapons. It had worked before. It would work again. The Americans would break and run, just as they always did when faced with true warriors. The night air smelled of salt water and jungle flowers. Stars filled the sky. In a few hours, the sun would rise over the Pacific, and Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto would lead his 120 men forward in a Banzai charge that would test everything he believed about war, courage, and the power of the human spirit against the machines of the modern world. The darkness before dawn felt thick and heavy as Takeshi and his men moved forward through the jungle. They walked in complete silence, each soldier stepping carefully to avoid breaking branches. 120 men moved like ghosts, their rifles and bayonets ready. All along the 3-kilometer front, 2,000 Japanese soldiers were doing the same thing, creeping toward American positions in the pre-dawn blackness. Takeshi could hear his own heartbeat and the quiet breathing of the man beside him. His grandfather's sword hung at his side, and he touched it once for luck. At exactly 5:30, as the first gray light touched the eastern sky, Captain Sato fired a signal flare. It arced up into the air, trailing green sparks. All along the line, Japanese soldiers rose from their crouching positions and began to run. The battle cry erupted from 2,000 throats at once. Tenno Heika Banzai! Tenno Heika Banzai! Long live the Emperor! The sound rolled across the island like thunder. Takeshi felt his blood surge with pride and excitement. This was the moment. This was what all their training had prepared them for. The charging soldiers crossed the first 100 meters quickly. The ground was relatively flat here, covered in short grass and scattered palm trees. Takeshi ran with his sword raised high, his men streaming forward around him. They covered 200 meters, then 300. Some American positions ahead looked abandoned. Takeshi saw empty sandbag walls and trenches with no soldiers visible. 400 meters gained. The Americans were fleeing already, just as predicted. They could not face warriors willing to die. Takeshi felt a surge of triumph. His lungs burned, but his legs kept pumping. Around him, his men shouted and ran, their bayonets glinting in the growing dawnlight. This was what courage looked like. This what spirit could accomplish. The soft Americans were running away, abandoning their positions without even fighting. Japan would win this battle, and then the next, and then the war. Then the sky turned white. High above the battlefield, brilliant lights suddenly blazed to life. Star shells, flares hanging from tiny parachutes, transforming night into artificial day. Takeshi could suddenly see everything, every soldier running forward, every open space, every tree. The entire battlefield was lit up like a stage. He squinted against the sudden brightness and kept running. But something felt wrong. The lights were too perfect, too well placed. It was as if someone had planned exactly where to illuminate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For 3 seconds, nothing happened except the lights burning overhead and Japanese soldiers running forward. Then the world exploded. The first artillery shells arrived so fast Takeshi did not hear them coming. One moment he was running, the next moment the ground 30 meters to his left erupted in a fountain of dirt and fire. Then another explosion 20 meters to his right. Then 3 more directly ahead. The blasts came so close together they sounded like one continuous roar. Takeshi threw himself flat on the ground as chunks of earth and shrapnel screamed through the air overhead. He looked up and saw hell. All across the battlefield, artillery shells were landing in perfect patterns. Not random fire, but organized, systematic destruction. Every 50 meters, explosions blossomed in neat rows. It was as if an invisible hand was painting death across the ground in careful brushstrokes. The shells came from multiple directions, all arriving at exactly the same instant. Takeshi had seen artillery before, but never anything like this. This was not individual guns firing when ready. This was something else entirely. The men running ahead of him simply vanished. One second, a squad of 8 soldiers was charging forward. The next second, an artillery shell exploded directly among them, and they were gone, erased from existence. Not wounded, not falling, just gone. Takeshi saw Sergeant Nakamura running 10 meters away, and then the sergeant's head disappeared in a spray of red mist. The body took 2 more steps before collapsing. More shells landed, walking forward in measured increments. Takeshi realized with horror that the American gunners were adjusting their fire systematically, moving the impact zone forward to catch running men. The artillery was not firing blindly. Someone was watching, directing, calculating. He heard explosions behind him now too, cutting off retreat. The Americans had them boxed in a killing zone. The shells made different sounds. Some exploded on impact with the ground, throwing up dirt and rocks. But others exploded in the air, 20 feet above the battlefield, and these were the most terrible. When they burst, thousands of metal fragments rained down like deadly hail. Men caught underneath were shredded. Takeshi saw an entire platoon cut down in seconds by one of these airbursts. 40 men had been running together, and then they were all on the ground, torn apart by invisible shrapnel from above. Takeshi tried to stand and run forward, but another barrage drove him back to the earth. Craters were appearing everywhere, some 10 feet across and 6 feet deep. The neat grass field was being churned into a moonscape of torn earth and smoke. He crawled toward a fresh crater and rolled into it, pressing his body against the dirt wall. 3 other soldiers tumbled in with him, their eyes wide with terror. The bombardment continued without pause. Shells landed every few seconds, sometimes several at once. Takeshi looked at his watch with shaking hands. Only 4 minutes had passed since the charge began. 4 minutes. He commanded 120 men. He carefully looked over the crater edge and counted the soldiers he could see still moving. 30. Maybe 30 men left, out of 120. The rest were dead, wounded, or scattered. Through the smoke and explosions, Takeshi heard something that made his blood run cold. American voices, calm and steady, speaking over radios. He could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were not panicking. They were not afraid. They sounded like men reading numbers from a list, casual and professional. Grid coordinates, he realized. They were calling out map positions to the artillery batteries, directing fire with precision. Between barrages, American machine guns opened up. These were not random bursts, but carefully aimed fire at specific points. Takeshi realized the machine gunners could see the entire battlefield, probably from elevated positions. They were shooting at soldiers trying to retreat, at clusters of men seeking cover, at anyone who moved. The machine gun fire came from fixed positions that never changed, as if the guns themselves were mounted on exact coordinates calculated in advance. Takeshi's sword lay in the dirt beside him, useless. His courage meant nothing here, his training meant nothing. All around him, the bravest men he knew were dying without ever seeing the enemy, cut down by shells fired from miles away by gunners who could not even see their targets. The Americans were not fighting them. The Americans were erasing them through mathematics and machines. A young private in the crater was crying, not from fear, but from shock and disbelief. This was not battle. This was not combat. This was industrial slaughter, systematic and efficient. Takeshi understood with terrible clarity that every step of their charge had been predicted, prepared for, pre-planned. The shallow American trenches had been bait. The entire battlefield was a trap, and Japanese courage had walked right into it. Takeshi woke to white light and the smell of chemicals. His head throbbed with pain that pulsed behind his eyes. He tried to move, but his left arm would not respond. When he looked down, he saw bandages wrapped around his shoulder and chest, clean white cloth that looked impossibly fresh. The last thing he remembered was an explosion very close, a wall of force lifting him into the air, and then nothing. He was alive. This single fact contradicted everything he had been taught. A Japanese officer captured alive brought eternal shame to his family. His ancestors would turn away from him in disgust. He should have died in that crater, sword in hand, taking enemies with him. Instead, he lay on a clean cot in what appeared to be a hospital tent. American voices spoke quietly nearby. No one was torturing him. No one seemed angry at all. An American medic noticed he was awake and came over. The man was young, maybe 20 years old, with red hair and freckles. He said something in English that Takeshi did not understand, but the tone was not cruel. The medic checked the bandages, made notes on a clipboard, and brought water in a metal cup. Takeshi's throat was so dry he drank without thinking. The water was cold and clean. The medic nodded and walked away to help another patient. Takeshi looked around the tent. Dozens of wounded men lay on cots, both American and Japanese. The Americans were treating enemy soldiers the same as their own, using the same medicine and bandages. Against one wall, Takeshi saw boxes stacked 6 feet high, all filled with medical supplies. There were more bandages in this one tent than his entire regiment had possessed, more bottles of medicine, more of everything. 3 days later, when Takeshi could walk, guards marched him and other prisoners to a compound surrounded by wire fences. He expected a dark pit, torture chambers, starvation. Instead, he found rows of wooden barracks with actual roofs. The guards were stern but not violent. They showed the prisoners where to sleep, where to wash, where meals would be served. That first meal shocked Takeshi more than anything else. Rice, yes, but also meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. More food on one plate than Japanese frontline officers received. One prisoner began to cry quietly at the sight of so much food. American officers came to interview the prisoners, asking questions through interpreters about Japanese positions and tactics. Takeshi refused to answer at first, but the Americans did not beat him. They simply moved on to other questions. One day, an American intelligence officer named Captain Morrison asked if Takeshi wanted to understand what had happened during the attack. Morrison spoke through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier who translated carefully. Morrison took Takeshi on a walk through the American base. They passed a supply area where artillery shells sat stacked in pyramids, thousands upon thousands of them. Each pyramid contained more shells than Takeshi's entire division had fired in a month. Morrison gestured at the stacks casually. These shells had come from just one supply ship, he explained. More ships arrived every week. Takeshi did the mathematics in his head and felt sick. The Americans had fired more ammunition in one night than Japan could manufacture in an entire month, maybe longer. They walked to a bunker built into a hillside. Inside, Takeshi saw something that changed everything he understood about warfare. American officers sat at tables covered with maps and charts. They used rulers and special sliding tools to calculate distances and angles. They spoke into radios that connected to artillery batteries miles away. On the walls hung large maps covered with grids, each square labeled with numbers and letters. Every piece of ground on the island had a coordinate, a specific mathematical address. Captain Morrison explained through the interpreter how the system worked. Observers hidden in trees and bunkers watched the battlefield with binoculars and radios. When they saw enemy soldiers, they radioed the coordinates to this bunker. Officers here did quick calculations using mathematics and called the numbers to multiple artillery batteries at once. Each battery adjusted its guns to fire at the same target from different angles. The officers calculated exactly when each shell would land, accounting for distance, wind, and even the temperature of the air. Then all the batteries fired at carefully timed intervals, so every shell arrived at the target at the exact same second. Takeshi stared at the maps and charts. The Americans had marked every Japanese trench, every supply dump, every path through the jungle. They had taken photographs from airplanes, looking down at the island like gods viewing a game board. The Americans had known exactly where the Japanese would attack 3 days before the attack happened. They had calculated the most likely routes and registered their artillery on those exact spots ahead of time. When the Banzai charge began, American gunners simply fired at pre-planned coordinates. They were not aiming at individual soldiers, they were firing at mathematical points on a map. Captain Morrison showed Takeshi a thick manual filled with tables and formulas. This book, he said, taught every artillery officer how to calculate fire. The mathematics inside could predict exactly where a shell would land, based on distance, angle, wind speed, temperature, and the type of gun. American artillery was not guessing, it was calculating. War had become a science problem, and the Americans treated it like engineers building a bridge. That night in his barracks, Takeshi lay awake thinking. His men had been brave. No one could question their courage. They had charged into certain death without hesitation, exactly as their training demanded. But their bravery had been wasted, spent against an enemy that did not need to match their courage because that enemy had something more powerful: organization, coordination, and industrial might. The Americans had not defeated Japan with superior warriors. They had defeated Japan with slide rules and radios and factories. While Japanese officers studied ancient sword techniques and meditated on spiritual purity, American officers studied mathematics and engineering. While Japan told its soldiers that spirit could overcome material disadvantages, America simply produced more material than Japan could imagine. Takeshi thought about his grandfather's sword, still lying somewhere in the dirt near that crater. The blade had been forged in 1850, using techniques passed down for centuries. It was beautiful, perfect, a work of art. But it was useless against artillery shells calculated by mathematics and delivered by machines. His grandfather had fought in a different kind of war, where courage and skill with weapons decided outcomes. That war was gone. The new war belonged to nations with factories, scientists, coordination systems, and resources. Every meal in the prison camp reminded Takeshi of this truth. The Americans fed their prisoners better than Japan fed its own soldiers fighting on the front lines. This was not because Americans were kind, though some were. It was because America had so much abundance that feeding prisoners well cost them almost nothing. Japan was starving its own people to keep the military supplied and still could not produce enough. America supplied its military and still had excess for everything else. Takeshi began to understand that the war had been lost before it started. Not lost because Japanese soldiers lacked courage or dedication. Lost because Japan had challenged an industrial giant with spiritual slogans and outdated tactics. The mathematics was simple and brutal. America could produce more ships, more planes, more guns, more shells, more everything than Japan could destroy. And America had learned how to use all those weapons together in coordinated systems that turned warfare into an industrial process. He thought about his men,
the 120 soldiers who had trusted him. 90 of them had died in 4 minutes. They had died bravely, but their deaths had accomplished nothing except to prove that courage alone could not defeat modern firepower directed by mathematics. This was the lesson written in blood across the Pacific. This was what Japan refused to learn until it was too late. The ship that carried Takeshi home arrived in Japan in November 1946, more than a year after the war ended. He stood at the railing watching his homeland appear through the mist, and his heart broke. The cities along the coast were flattened, reduced to ash and rubble. Where factories had once stood, only twisted metal frames remained, like the skeletons of giant animals. The ship docked at a port where half the buildings were destroyed. People on the shore looked thin, their clothes ragged and patched. Japan had lost everything.
Takeshi carried a small canvas bag with his few possessions. Inside was an American artillery manual that Captain Morrison had given him, translated sections marked in pencil. Also, photographs of the Fire Direction Center, showing the maps and radio equipment and calculating tools. Morrison had said Takeshi should keep these things, that Japan would need to learn new ways of thinking if it wanted to rebuild. Takeshi had thanked him quietly, still uncomfortable with the fact that an enemy had shown him more professional respect than some of his own officers had. The train ride to Hiroshima took 6 hours through countryside that looked exhausted. Rice fields lay untended. Villages had roofs patched with scrap metal and canvas. Everyone looked hungry. An old woman sitting across from Takeshi shared a small rice ball with him, even though she clearly had little food herself. This was still Japan, still a place where people helped each other with quiet dignity. But the confidence was gone, the certainty that Japan was destined for greatness. Reality had crushed those dreams into dust. Hiroshima was worse than Takeshi had imagined. He had heard about the bomb, the single weapon that destroyed an entire city in one flash of light. Hearing about it and seeing it were different things. The center of the city was simply gone, erased. A few concrete buildings stood like broken teeth, but everything else for miles around had been vaporized or burned. His family's house, his school, the temple where he had prayed as a child, all gone. Only photographs remained to prove they had ever existed. His mother and younger sister had survived because they were visiting relatives in the countryside when the bomb fell. His father and grandfather had been in the city. They died instantly, along with 70,000 others. Takeshi found his mother living in a small wooden shack on the edge of what had been their neighborhood. She was 45 but looked 70, her hair white, her face lined with grief and radiation sickness. When she saw him, she cried and held him for a long time without speaking. That night, sitting on the floor of the tiny shack with a single candle burning, Takeshi told his mother about the war. He told her about the Banzai charge, about watching his men die in 4 minutes, about the American artillery coordination that had made courage meaningless. He showed her the manual and photographs. He explained how the Americans had turned warfare into mathematics, how they had known every move Japan would make before Japan made it. His mother listened quietly, then said something that surprised him. She was not angry that he had been captured alive. She was grateful he had survived to come home. Too many mothers had lost their sons to a war that should never have been fought. The shame, she said, was not in surviving. The shame was in the men who had sent young soldiers to die in attacks that could never succeed, who had believed spirit could defeat science, who had refused to see reality until atomic fire consumed entire cities in seconds. Over the following months, Takeshi tried to find work. Japan was occupied by American forces, and the country was being rebuilt under American supervision. The occupiers were not cruel. They brought food, medicine, and supplies. They helped restart factories and repair infrastructure. Once again, Takeshi saw American abundance and organization at work. The same nation that had destroyed Japan was now helping it rebuild, and doing so with efficiency that amazed everyone who saw it. Takeshi eventually found work teaching at a military academy that was training officers for what would become Japan's self-defense forces. The old Imperial Army was dissolved, forbidden from ever reforming. The new military would be smaller, defensive only, focused on protecting Japan rather than conquering neighbors. Takeshi taught modern warfare doctrine to young officers who had been children during the war. He emphasized coordination, communication, and the integration of different weapon systems. He taught them that courage mattered but was not enough. Modern warfare required organization and technology working together. Some of the older instructors disagreed with him. They still believed that Japan had lost because of bad luck or betrayal, not because of fundamental problems with military thinking. They talked about how Japanese soldiers had fought to the last man, how the spirit of Bushido had never wavered. Takeshi would listen patiently and then show them the mathematics. He would explain how American artillery batteries had been linked by radio, how forward observers had directed fire in real time, how every aspect of the battlefield had been calculated and measured. He would ask a simple question: if spirit alone could win wars, why had Japan lost? The discussions were difficult because they touched on painful truths. Japan had sent its young men to die in human wave attacks against coordinated firepower. Japan had built its military strategy on concepts from the 1800s while facing enemies using technology from the 1940s. The Banzai charges had not failed because Japanese soldiers were cowards. They had failed because the entire concept was obsolete, a relic from a different era of warfare. Admitting this meant admitting that thousands of young men had died for nothing, following orders based on fantasy rather than reality. Takeshi's sister married an engineer who worked on rebuilding Hiroshima's infrastructure. His mother lived to see the city rise from the ashes, new buildings replacing the ones destroyed by the atomic bomb. Japan embraced technology and industry with the same dedication it had once devoted to military conquest. Factories hummed day and night. Companies competed to build better products more efficiently. The same national focus that had driven the war effort now drove economic development. By the 1970s, Japan had become one of the world's leading industrial nations. The transformation amazed people who remembered the devastation of 1945. Takeshi, now in his 50s and teaching at a prestigious university, often thought about what had made this possible. Japan had learned the lesson written in blood across the Pacific Islands. Modern success required coordination, organization, quality control, and systematic thinking. The same principles that had made American artillery so devastating could be applied to building cars, electronics, and ships. One day, a journalist interviewed Takeshi for a documentary about the Pacific War. The journalist asked him what he had learned from his experience, what message he would want future generations to understand. Takeshi thought for a long moment before answering. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care, his voice steady but sad. "We were told that spirit could overcome material," he said. "We believed that 100 million Japanese hearts beating as one would defeat American machines. We were wrong. The Americans did not beat us with courage, though their soldiers were brave. They beat us with coordination. Every artillery battery linked by radio. Every shell calculated by mathematics. Every target photographed from airplanes. Every attack anticipated and prepared for. We charged into killing zones that had been measured and registered days before we arrived. The Americans protected themselves with trigonometry and systematic thinking. My 120 men died in 4 minutes, Takeshi continued. Not because they were cowards, not because Americans were superhuman, but because Japan sent 19th century warriors against 20th century industrial warfare. We believed in our ancestors' spirits and the purity of our intentions. The Americans believed in coordination, calculation, and overwhelming firepower delivered with precision. They turned warfare into a science problem and solved it with engineering."
The lesson is not that Japanese were foolish, Takeshi said. The lesson is that modern challenges require modern solutions. Courage matters. Dedication matters. but they must be combined with organization, technology, and clear-eyed understanding of reality. We learned this lesson in blood. 90 of my men paid the price for our nation's refusal to see the world as it was, rather than as we wished it to be. Takeshi looked directly at the camera. I hope the world never forgets this, he said. I hope no other nation sends its young people to die because leaders believed in comforting myths instead of hard truths. War is terrible, but war fought with outdated thinking is a special kind of tragedy. My men deserved better. They deserved leaders who understood the world they were fighting in. The interview ended. Takeshi walked home through streets filled with new buildings, cars, and people hurrying to work. Japan had rebuilt itself by embracing the very things it had once dismissed: coordination, technology, systematic organization, and respect for scientific reality. The nation that had sent men to die in Banzai charges now competed on global markets with precision manufacturing and quality control. The transformation was complete. The lesson had been learned. The price had been terrible, but perhaps the memory would prevent future generations from paying it again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.